Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to another Israel Insights webinar. I am Amichai Magen, and today is the very first time that I can say with great joy and pride that I am the director of the Yan Kum Israel Studies program here at FSI Stanford. That is new, but the format of our webinar remains the same. We'll have a total of 75 minutes. We're going to hear a talk from my dear friend, Dr. Emmanuel Navon today, who will address us for about 40 to 45 minutes. And then we will have Q&A, and you are warmly invited to post your questions at any given moment through the Q&A tab, not the chat tab, the Q&A tab on the Zoom platform. As always, we record the webinar, and it will be subsequently posted on CDDRL's YouTube channel, and you can make sure that you can see all previous recordings and sign up to future webinars on our website. Simply go to cddrl.fsi.stanford.edu/Israel, and you'll have all of that information, and you can also sign up to be notified about future events by pressing the big red icon just below the text that says who we are. Okay, so with all that in mind, today I'm delighted to welcome my good long-standing friend, Dr. Emmanuel Navon, who will address us on the topic of understanding Israel's foreign policy, past, present, and possible futures. You'll see that Emmanuel has a penchant for writing big, broad books. He doesn't go for the capillaries, he goes for the jugular. And that also is true for his new book, which we'll mention in a moment. But let me just tell you a little bit about Emmanuel, who I think I first met in Jerusalem in 1998, Emmanuel. It's been a while. So Emmanuel is a French-born... Yeah, it's been a while. Emmanuel is a French-born Israeli international relations scholar, author, and foreign policy expert. He lectures in international relations at Tel Aviv University. He is a senior fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, and he is a foreign policy analyst for I-24 News in English and French. And he has published in leading international relations and political science journals, and his commentary has appeared in outlets such as Le Monde and Newsweek and elsewhere. And previously, Navon also served as the CEO of ELNET-Israel, which is a public policy think tank focused on foreign policy issues and Israeli-European relations. Emmanuel is the author of several books, including The Star and the Scepter, A Diplomatic History of Israel. The book was published in 2020 and has since been translated into French, Hebrew, Italian, Japanese, and Mandarin. That book will serve as the basis for much of today's talk, but a lot has happened since 2020, and I'm sure Emmanuel will reflect that today. But I also wanted to make sure that you know about Emmanuel's forthcoming book, The Continent and the High Seas, an historical guide to world politics, which should be published next year. So Emmanuel, lovely, great to see you. I think you're at home in Jerusalem or thereabouts. And we'll hear from you for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So Baruch haba.
Thank you, Amichai. Thank you. A pleasure to be here. And as you said, we've known each other for a long time. It was actually since 1997 when we were young fellows at the Jerusalem, at the Shalem Center in Israel, doing our PhDs at the time. So, it's been a long time. And today's presentation or talk is indeed based on my book, The Star and the Scepter, A Diplomatic History of Israel. As you mentioned, Amichai, I like to have broad books. So this book only covers 3,500 years of history, right? So we're not going to cover 3,000 3,500 years of history in 45 minutes because, by my calculation, if anybody falls asleep for 2 minutes, you'll miss at least 300 years of history. And even though it's the evening here and it's the morning by you, as you mentioned, Amichai, the book was published already. I can't believe it's already 5 years. It's about time really to publish an updated version because some stuff has happened since then, except my publisher needs to sell a couple of other copies in order to agree to a new version. So, as I always tell my students, what's important about my book is not for you to read it, but to buy it. So if everybody in this seminar buys 2 copies, my publisher will agree to publish a updated version. I'm kidding. But you can buy the book, that's fine. Anyway, so as I said, covering 3,500 years of diplomatic history is quite ambitious. And what I'd like to do today, since obviously Israel, after 2 years after October 7, has experienced one of the worst crises in its modern history. And the question is, how did it affect and how is it going to affect its foreign policy in the years to come? And the reason why I like to study history is because I think that you cannot understand the present and you cannot understand foreign policy and international relations if you don't understand history. I'm really not a big fan of international relation theory. I prefer history. And Amichai mentioned my upcoming book, which is really a history of international relations, an attempt to understand international relations and world politics through the prism of history. And it's inspired by what Churchill said when he was asked after he was no longer prime minister and he gave a lecture, one of his many lectures in America. And one of the students asked him, what was the secret of being a great statesman? And of course, he was the right person to ask because he was obviously a great statesman. And his answer was, study history. In history lie all the secrets of statecraft. And that's what I try to do in my work, including in that book. So I would start with the fact that on October 7, 2023, Israel's wall of deterrence collapsed both physically and conceptually. The idea of Israel's defense establishment, but also of Israel's foreign policy attitude, was that Israel could, in fact, survive and thrive behind a physical and allegorical war of deterrence. And that concept collapsed because, obviously, one of the founding fathers of this conception was, of course, Vladimir Jabotinsky, who published this famous article in 2023 named The Iron Wall. And what he was arguing at the time...
Emmanuel, in 1923.
What did I say?
You said 2023. So just a
sorry. Yeah, just added 100 years. Yes, thank you. 1923. And this article was actually pretty controversial at the time because what he was saying is that, look, we, the Jews, the Zionists, however you call them, we're not going to have the agreement of the Arab population to establish a sovereign Jewish state. And we cannot fool them into pretending that this is not our end game. And we're not going to buy them out with economic advantages. So either you give up or you persist and you basically impose your project behind an allegorical wall of determination and deterrence. And even though he had a very tense relationship with David Ben-Gurion, they really had a very bad relationship. There was a lot of tension between themselves and their followers. But at the end of the day, when you read what David Ben-Gurion writes and says from the late 1920s, definitely after the massacre of the Jewish population in the cities of Jerusalem, Safed, and Hebron, among others, Ben-Gurion basically endorses Jabotinsky's paradigm, despite the differences between them. And for many decades, this concept has very much influenced Israeli decision-making, both the military and the foreign policy establishment. And that was very much, that kind of collapsed on October 7th, because I think one of the things that Israel underestimated is that it doesn't matter how strong you are, especially physically, if you have in front of you an ideology that is committed to your destruction and that is willing to pay any price for you to die, because this is a testimony that the Israeli army got from many of the Hamas terrorists that were caught after October 7th. They said, we knew we were going to die, but it was worth it. They were told that, just to kill 1,000 and 2,000 Jews, everything is worth it. And therefore, when you have also in front of you this ideology of martyrdom, of it's worth losing everything and dying en masse if you're going to kill a few thousand Jews, and when you have also don't forget the Iranian regime, right? The Islamic Republic, established in 1979, is very deeply ideological. This is a theocracy whose official ideology is Shia Islam and the 12th Imam Islam. They really believe that in order for the hidden Imam to reappear, you have to have this final and total war with the Jewish people and with the West. And therefore, they've been building this network of destruction against Israel to destroy Israel, but also, in their view, to bring redemption to the world, because their Imam is only going to reappear and produce this perfect world only when the Jews disappear. So actually killing all the Jews and defeating the West is a good thing, right? In their view, right? And they were really ready to do anything to accomplish this vision, including spending billions and billions of dollars on building this huge network, which, by the way, they have the nerve of calling the axis of resistance. It's an axis of aggression, obviously, because it's there to destroy Israel. It's an axis of aggression, which, of course, they call an axis of resistance. And you need to understand that it doesn't matter how strong you are and how scary you are. In the West, we have this concept since Thomas Hobbes, in his book, The Leviathan, that you need a scary creature, the state. You need the state to deter its citizens from one another. And of course, the implication in foreign policy is that if you want to prevent war, you need to deter your enemies, right? That was also the concept of the balance of power after the Congress of Vienna and Napoleonic Wars, right? That you need to deter your neighbors, right? But you cannot deter an ideology that is willing to pay any price and to do anything to kill you and to destroy you, thinking that it will bring redemption to the world. You cannot deter that, right? And this, I think, is one of the big paradigm shifts of the post-October 7 Israeli foreign policy. So I mentioned the ideological background of the Iron Wall paradigm, but of course we have to zoom it out further back in history. And here, allow me again to explain also the title of my book, which will bring me to what I want to talk about also, the Star and the Scepter. Why the Star and the Scepter? It's inspired from a verse in the book of Numbers, where it says in chapter 24, a star rises from Jacob and a scepter comes forth from Israel. And the question is, what does it mean? Especially since we know that Jacob and Israel are in fact the same person, right? So my reading is that the star is associated to Jacob and the scepter to Israel, because the star is a symbol, of course, the symbol of Judaism. The Star of David is the symbol of Jewish identity and spirituality, call it, or Jewish faith. And a scepter is always a symbol, of course, of political power or physical power, right? And my claim in this book after reviewing, as I said, 3 millennia of Jewish diplomacy, is that the Jewish people has always kind of oscillated between those two poles, between, you know, are you only a people of a message, of a faith, of a spirituality, or of political power? Can you have both? And I claim also that in a way in the biblical story, because I think that you know one of the reasons I have 3 chapters in the book dedicated to what I call Israel and the nations in the Hebrew Bible is because I don't think you can understand the Jewish psyche and how Jews perceive themselves without some kind of understanding and familiarity with the Hebrew Bible, right? So in the story of the Bible, right, Jacob and his brother Esau are described as complete opposites, as Rome and as Athens and Sparta, if you like. Esau was a man of physical strength without spirituality, and Jacob is a man of spirituality without any physical strength. And it is only when Jacob is assaulted by this mysterious angel, a man in the middle of the night, before he faces his revengeful brother Esau, it's only after he proves his ability and willingness to fight in the real world for his ideals and for his spiritual inheritance that he is named Israel, in Hebrew, Israel, which means the fighter of God. Right? But you'll notice that his name keeps changing back and forth. Sometimes he's called Jacob, sometimes he's called Israel. So what's going on? Did he change his name or not? Right? And I think that the message here is that it's always hard to find this kind of balance and equilibrium in the real world between what we call in foreign policy, realpolitik, and idealism. This tension, of course, between realpolitik, political realism, and your ideals and your values is something that many nations experience. I'm sure it's less of an issue, of an existential issue, without offending anyone, in the case of, let's say, Micronesia or Luxembourg. But let's say for people like the Jewish people that has this very ancient history and a very strong sense of historical purpose, and that operates in a very challenging environment, this tension is very real indeed. And it's been true throughout Jewish history. And of course, there's no formula about when do you draw the line, what is the correct balance between the two. When should you go only for political realism and compromise with your principles? And when should you be completely faithful to them? There's no algorithm, but as Churchill said, learning history can be a very good guide. Now, a second quote in the beginning of my book, next to this verse from the Hebrew Bible in Numbers, is a quote from Cardinal de Richelieu, which I think also very well expresses what I'm trying to say. And Richelieu said the following, in French, of course, but we'll go for the English version. Man is immortal, his salvation is hereafter. The state has no immortality, its salvation is now or never. Now, why did he say that? Because Richelieu was both a clergyman, he was a senior member of the Catholic Church, but he was also a statesman. He was the equivalent of what we would call today a prime minister under Louis XIII. And Richelieu basically invented the concept of raison d'etat, the interest of the state, or what the Germans called realpolitik, or the Italians called ragione di Stato. And the idea was that during the 30 Years' War, obviously being a cardinal of the Catholic Church, he should have sided with the emperor and the Catholics, obviously. But in fact, he sided with the Protestants, even though he had no sympathy for them, because we know how he fought them in the most merciless manner in France itself. But why did he choose to side with the Protestants? Because he wanted the Holy Roman Empire, which, as Voltaire said, was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, to bleed to death, and he wanted the civil war to last as long as possible. And that's why he cynically held the Protestants to make sure that this war would continue and that to call it by its name, Germany, would emerge much weaker from it, which is what eventually happened. And when he was accused of betraying the church and betraying his ideology, he came up with this formula, which is to say, the world to come is only for human beings. The state has no world to come. Its salvation is now or never. And that is, of course, an extreme example of realpolitik. Now, we know that in ancient Jewish history, the Jews were faced with this dilemma many times, right? So to give a few examples, of course, in a couple of weeks, it will be the holiday of Hanukkah, where the Jews celebrate the victory over the Greek Empire. So there, the revolt and faithfulness to your identity and history worked. But a few centuries later, against Rome, it was a disaster, right? The revolt of Bar Kokhba ended up in complete disaster. So in the first case, you could say, well, in that case, being faithful to your identity and history worked. In the second case, you should have gone for political realism, because obviously the Romans were much stronger. And by the way, I very much recommend to read or reread the book of Flavius Josephus, The Jewish Wars, because there's so fascinating description there of this dilemma where you see Jewish leaders trying to assess whether they should or they should not revolt, what are the chances of winning and losing, whether or not God is on their side or not on their side, whether they should fight on the Jewish Sabbath. You see those dilemmas. It's just amazing. It's just a treaty of political science and foreign policy. Written by Flavius Josephus, and you see how ancient those dilemmas are, right? Now, obviously, during centuries, 17th or 18th centuries of exiles, the Jews were stateless, and therefore this dilemma of political realism versus values was a bit less of an issue, even though there were, of course, many cases of Jewish diplomacy in exile. But of course, in the modern era, when basically, to make a long story short, the idea of rebuilding Jewish power, of going back to the scepter, right? And not only the star. It's interesting because in modern times, basically after the French Revolution, the unwritten deal between the Jews of France and after that of the French Empire under Bonaparte was that how can the French Revolution grant citizenship and equality to the Jews if they are a separate nation? Now, there was absolutely no doubt to Europeans at the time that the Jews were a separate nation in exile, right? In fact, in a few European languages, in Italian, to say a Jew, you say ebreo, Hebrew, right? It was no doubt that the Jews, they were Hebrews. They were a separate nation that had been exiled from the land. And so the question is, if there was now equality according to the French Revolution, how could you turn these foreigners into Frenchmen, right? So the solution, so to speak, was spelled out by a member of the French National Assembly after the revolution, Stanislas de Clermont-Tonnerre, who famously said regarding the Jews, well, I'm ready to give them everything as individuals, but nothing as a nation. So they can become French if they officially declare that they are only a religion. So you can be Jewish, you can be Protestant, you can be Catholic, but they have to check their nationality at the door. And this was officially basically demanded by Napoleon Bonaparte when he became emperor, and he convened what he called a Sanhedrin, really a Sanhedrin, like the court from the time of ancient Israel, the Sanhedrin in French, right? And he basically demanded from France's rabbis to officially declare that the Jews were giving up their scepter and only keeping the star. And that was the unwritten deal after the French Revolution. But that unwritten deal was basically broken by the French themselves, of course, with the Dreyfus Affair, because if in the most liberal and secular country of continental Europe, basically the Jews were still considered foreigners. Alfred Dreyfus had played the game to the end. He had become even an officer in the French army. So why was he still accused of being a foreigner? And this is really what shocked Theodor Herzl when he was the correspondent of the Neue Freie Presse in Paris. Basically, he was saying the deal is off. The deal is off. We've been we've been betrayed, basically. So we are going to recover our scepter, right? If we still considered a foreign nation, so fine. So we'll rebuild that nation. But he was very much opposed, not only for theological reasons by what we call today the ultra-Orthodox or the Haredis, but mostly from assimilated Western Jews, especially German ones. It's very clear when you read the writings of a German intellectual like Franz Rosenzweig. For him, and he even wrote a book, The Star of the Redemption, right? It's only the start. The Jews are only supposed to be a spiritual message, and God forbid they shouldn't deal with power or something because it corrupts, right? And they very much oppose the idea of going back to building temporal power and physical power. They said, no, we're supposed to bring a message to the world. We're supposed to only be Jacob and the star. And you did have also, on the other hand, in the Zionist movement, some tendencies who were only about building physical power. Of course, the most extreme were the Canaanites, who only wanted to build power, completely disconnected from Jewish history, completely disconnected from any type of spirituality. So you see this kind of a tension, right? And it was true at the very beginning of the Zionist movement. But what is true also is that very early, when the moment Herzl convened the Zionist Congress, basically he turned an idea into an institution. And he became a de facto diplomat, meeting with world leaders, trying to sell them the idea of renewed Jewish statehood. But very, very soon, the Jewish national movement faced this dilemma of political realism versus ideology. I think the first test was, after Herzl tried to convince many leaders in Europe and in the Ottoman Empire, when, at the end of the day, the ancient historical Jewish homeland was ruled by the Turks, right? And of course, the Ottoman Sultan was not interested in enabling the Jews to rebuild the country because, for ideological reason, it was unacceptable to a Muslim leader to enable the Jews, the dhimmis, to rebuild their nation. That was unacceptable. But also because he, at the time, most Zionists were Russian socialists, and he didn't think he needed these troublemakers in his empire. But in any case, the Middle East was ruled by the Turks, and it was hopeless. So eventually, as we know, the Secretary of the Colonies of the British Empire suggested to Herzl an alternative land in Uganda, right? Now, Herzl was not interested in establishing a Jewish homeland in Uganda, in Africa, but the idea was that there was an emergency. And why was there an emergency? He saw it maybe as a temporary solution because the year 1903, don't forget, was the year of the pogrom in Kishinev in Russia. So there was a need, there was an emergency. So here you had a first case, I would say, the first test for the Zionist movement of realpolitik, what the world can offer to you right now. There's an emergency. You have those pogroms in Russia, but it's in Africa. So you give up completely on your ideals, or you stick to your principles, to your ideals, to your ideology, but you have to push it up. Now, of course, at the end, the proposal was completely rejected at the Zionist Congress, but I would say it was the first test of this dilemma between realpolitik and ideology, between the star and the scepter. And of course, it repeated itself many times in history, even before independence. And I think the second big crisis in that sense was the 1937 partition plan offered by the Peel Commission. Same idea. I mean, here what you have is, it becomes obvious to the British Empire that there is a limit to their cynical divide and rule tactics in British Palestine, because, of course, the British were masters of turning communities against one another, because this brilliant French and British invention of the mandate, right? Something that they sold to President Wilson when he said they had to give up their empires. They said, well, we are going to give up our empires, but we're not just grabbing the empire of the Turks and the Germans in Africa. We're just going to call them mandates, right? And they are given to us by the League of Nations. And the League of Nations at the time is mostly France and Britain, because nobody else is part of it. And then not the US, not Russia, not Germany, not anybody. It's basically, they grant themselves those mandates. And when will they be independent? We'll tell you. when they pass their test in French and English and whatever. So, and the idea was it's going to last forever because they're all going to kill each other. They're never going to get along. And so we'll always have an excuse to stay. But in Palestine, this new entity which the British created, it's really not going very well because you have this civil war, just like in Spain, by the way, in 1936, between Jews and Arabs, which, by the way, in the British Palestine, the British Mandate in Palestine, the revolt led by Haj Amin al-Husseini is also supported actively by Hitler and Mussolini, just as they did for Franco in Spain. But in any case, the British understand that this is not going to last, it's not going to work, and they establish a commission and say, okay, what are we doing with this mess? And the commission established by Lord Peel says, okay, partition, they don't agree, they can't live together, you create two states. And to come up with lines, with a kind of a map, which when you look at the partition plan of 1937, it's basically like 10% or 15% of the original British mandate for a Jewish state. It's really teeny, what is today the Galilee, more or less, and the coastal plain, and not even close to Jerusalem, which completely stays under British hands. Now, here again, huge dilemma in the what is called in Hebrew the Yishuv, the Jewish Society of British Palestine. What do? Do you take the offer, which is a terrible offer? And why now? Because there's an emergency. Why is there an emergency? Because the Nazis have been in power in Germany for 4 years, and you need to be, and no country is willing to accept the Jews, and you need a refuge here and now, immediately. But on the other hand, you basically give up on your dream and on your ideology because you basically, it doesn't. Jerusalem, it's only a very teeny piece of land in a very small part of the historical Jewish homeland. And here you had this huge dilemma, these huge fights, by the way, which became moot because at the end of the day, the British themselves shelved the plan, so it became completely moot. But the debate around the 1937 partition plan in the British Mandate really shaped Israel's political map for years to come, and very much shaped also the way the leaders at the time eventually perceived foreign policy. Where do you put the line between realism? It's very interesting, realism and idealism. It's very interesting, by the way, when you look at how the different political families in the Yishuv reacted to the partition plan of 1937. Because, I always claim, for example, that one of the ways to explain the difference or the tension between political realism and idealism, why do some people prefer ideology or idealism and others, political realism? Is it a matter of taste? So I claim that one of the explanations is that generally, people who call themselves realists tend to believe that reality is a given and you have to adapt yourself to reality. And people who generally are idealists tend to believe that you can adapt reality to your ideology, which is very clear of Immanuel Kant, for example. Kant is really somebody who believes that, you should impose your ideology on reality. And when he writes his Perpetual Peace in 1795, it's really a work plan of how to establish perpetual peace. You have a plan and you impose it on reality. So you really have to believe that you have this ability to reshape reality. Otherwise, you say, no, I have to adapt myself to reality, of course. And then there's the issue of whether or not you are willing to rely on the goodwill and good nature of other people. Are you skeptical about human nature, or are you trustworthy of other people, right? So that's also another dividing line generally between realist and idealist. And you really see it on the political map of the Jewish population of British Palestine in the 1930s, right? You have the extremes, right? So you have, on both extremes, you have, for example, the academics from Hebrew University, people like Martin Buber and Yehuda Magnes, who are completely against Jewish statehood. They want some kind of a federation between Jews and Arabs that will be incorporated to a global federation, and prophesied by Immanuel Kant. And here the idea is like, forget about reality, have an ideal of complete peace, and therefore they oppose partition because you don't need partition. You need brotherhood and love between Jews and Arabs and the rest of humanity. And on the other hand, on the other extreme, you have people from the hardline movements such as Israel Eldad and the Stem group, who said we don't care about reality either. We have a plan. It's a Jewish kingdom, a nation, and forget about the the constraints of reality, we'll just impose it because that's what we want. So on both sides, complete disregard for reality. What I want, whether it's John Lennon, peace and love, or whether it is I want my whole land and who cares about reality, it's complete disregard for reality, right? And then in the middle, you had people who tried to figure out what's the best way of handling this tension. And here, of course, Ben Gurion, emerged as the leader of what became Israel, precisely because, on the one hand, he had a very strong sense of history. He was not a Canaanite, he was very well aware and knowledgeable about Jewish history. And when you read Israel's Declaration of Independence, he carries 3,500 years of history on his shoulders, right? But he was also a man who realized the limits of power. And he was willing to accept the plan in 1937, which he did at the end, as he did 10 years later with the UN partition plan, which was a little bit better, but not much, because he said you have to grab what you can be offered. And then, anyways, reality will enable you to improve and change the borders, which is also what happened during Israel's War of Independence, 1948. And so here, I think this kind of combination between this political realism of the Scepter, but also this faithfulness to your history of the star. This is also what made, I think, Ben Gurion a great leader. He made mistakes. He made many mistakes. But I think he had this combination of this very strong sense of history and of political realism. And you also see how he managed the war of independence. And he also very much shaped Israeli foreign policy for the years to come. But the thing is, at the beginning of Israel's independence, the dilemmas continued because, of course, the focus in the beginning was to fight the war and win it, which eventually happened with the armistice agreements in 1949. But another question that very much divided the political leadership at the time, besides the issue of partition, which was the issue in the 1930s after 1937, and then it became the issue of who should Israel be aligned with on the world scene in the Cold War, because the international system was now a system characterized by the Cold War between the new superpowers. So should Israel be aligned with the United States or with the Soviet Union, or be neutral, for example, right? So here again, you had definitely in Ben Gurion's coalition and in some people in his party who said, what do you mean? It's obvious. We have to align with the socialist Soviet Union. First of all, don't forget that this was before we knew all the atrocities committed by Stalin, and he was still considered a hero by many people because of the role played by the Soviet Union, of course, in defeating Nazi Germany. And also don't forget that Stalin voted in favor of the partition plan at the UN and recognized Israel for his own reason, which we don't have time to discuss now. So he was very much admired by a lot of people and said, well, he's the Soviet Union is the force of progress, of the future, of equality. Of course, we have to go with them. And Ben Gurion said, no way. On paper, he was a socialist too, right? But he wasn't, in fact. And he said, no, the Soviet Union is the historical enemy of the Jewish people. He had very tough words against the Soviet Union. And he said, and basically he understood, as Churchill did, by the way. I have a chapter in my book on Russia. And how much time do I have, Amichai? Because I can go on for hours. I love listening to myself.
I know.
I'm kidding.
Emmanuel, I think you can take another 7 or 8 minutes. Is that okay?
So,
and maybe also kind of bring
Ben
us
Gurion,
up.
why does Ben Gurion? Yeah. Sorry.
And then maybe bring us up to today, and maybe say a word about how the balance between the star and the scepter is shaping Israeli foreign policy today.
So what I was saying is that Ben Gurion saw in Russia the historical enemy of the Jews, and one of the reasons is that in 1917 you have two types of revolutions. You have the communist revolution in Russia, but you also have the Balfour Declaration, right? And it's fascinating because Winston Churchill, I mentioned him before, he wrote an article in 1921, and it's called the struggle for the soul of the Jewish people, Zionism versus Bolshevism. And he says basically, you have in 1917 two ways of solving the Jewish question. One is realistic and is right and is to rebuild a Jewish nation, and the other one is to build a perfect world and to erase religions and nations and to bring redemption to the world. And the Jews going for this nonsense are really doing a disservice to the people and to humanity. So he said, I vote for the Zionists. And basically, so does Ben-Gurion. He said, there is, of course, a complete, there's a clash, an ideological clash between, of course, the Soviet communism and Zionism, not only also because, with 3 million Jews in the Soviet Union, they don't want the Jews to move to Israel and question the fact that the Soviet Union is the perfect model for the Jews and other nations. So Ben-Gurion decides to align with the West, and his government was almost toppled when in 1950 he sides with South Korea and the Korean War, and his partners, and especially his leftist partners, his coalition, say, are you out of your mind? We should align with the imperialistic West against our brothers in Russia. And of course, Ben-Gurion says, what do you mean imperialism? The Soviet Union is not an empire? What are you talking about? But and I think that his very deep historical understanding and his realism it was really what made him a great statesman. Now, we're coming to today. I think that we saw this dilemma again with the war in Ukraine, when Israel at the beginning was a bit hesitant because of the interest with Russia, etc. And at the time, I remember I always claimed very early on that Israel should have been more outspoken against Russia and behave like Ben in 1950 when he said, "There's nothing. We're not going to get anything from the Russians, even if we're less vocal against them." And I think it's true again today. Now, of course, today the dilemmas are we have multiple dilemmas for Israel's foreign policy. I mentioned Russia and Ukraine, for example, but also when it comes to the crisis within the Western world. The crisis of democracy, basically, and how you see this challenging of traditional political parties in Europe and in the West in general. And this also creates new dilemmas for Israel, especially after October 7th. Because, today in Europe, and as Amichai mentioned, I'm kind of involved with Europe in my work. When you see how they relate to Israel, how political parties and public figures and intellectuals relate to Israel today, it's very clear, and I'll finish with that, and then I'll take your question, that Israel is very much the focus of the political debate in Europe. People are not indifferent at all about Israel. They're passionate about it. And it's true also in the United States. Either they're very much in favor or very much against. Why? Because it brings them back to their internal and domestic political divides today in the West. Are you or not in favor of preserving traditional Western values, which come from Christianity, therefore from Judaism, and Athens and Rome, or not? Or do you think that the West is the incarnation of evil, and you want to deconstruct Western society with a partner which is called radical Islam, which has the same plan exactly, which is why you have this alliance between the woke and Islam, which makes no sense until you understand that they have a common enemy, as they did, by the way, at the beginning of the Islamic Revolution against the Shah. The communists and the Islamists allied to one another, and of course, once the Islamists won, they killed all the communists. So the communists, the left in the West, is always the useful idiots of the Islamists. It was true also in 1979. By the way, even I mentioned the deconstruction, the popularity of, I was born and grew up in France, so I couldn't believe when I started studying in university in Israel that people were actually reading and taking people like Foucault and Derrida. I was like, I grew up in France, and this is the kind of authors that you read as a teenager just to annoy your parents. Everybody knows it's nonsense. They know it's nonsense. They're just making fun of everybody else. But the Americans don't understand that. So they translate this into English and don't understand the irony of this French cynicism. The French don't take it seriously. Only the Americans in their English translations, but whatever. So this admiration for Foucault, deconstruction, the West. But Foucault, when Khomeini was in exile in this Paris suburb of Neuf-le-Château, He went to visit him, and he said he's a hero. He's a new Mahatma Gandhi. He's a holy man. He described Khomeini as a holy man. Of course, Foucault was an expert in holiness, as we know, in his personal lifestyle, and so did Jean-Paul Sartre also. They had only praise for Khomeini, right? So it's not new, this fascination in the West for the enemies of the West. And so those who want to deconstruct Western civilization hate Israel because they see a country that and not only is at the core of the civilization, because the Western civilization is Rome, Athens, and Jerusalem, but also they see a very proud nation state that is very successful. And conservatives in Europe and in America today, they love Israel because Israel, hits all the right boxes. A proud nation state that is both a successful economy with traditional family values and very high birth rates, that knows how to fight, Islamist armies, and so that's why Israel today has new opportunities in terms of its foreign policy, but it also requires to really fine-tune a relation with the different parties in Europe, because some of them have changed, some less so. But we have to be careful with what we do, but we have to be aware of the fact that the same way that we've gone through a turning point and a crisis after October 7, so is the West today. And it creates many opportunities, many challenges, because we see what's happening today with Israel and with many politicians in the West on campuses, etc., but also many opportunities. So I will stop here because I could continue, but let's take questions. And
Emmanuel, we could continue this for like a Dan Carlin podcast for 3.5 hours, very easily. But this is terrific. We tend to think, or there's a sort of a common assumption that thinking about Jewish political history is really thinking about discontinuity rather than continuity. I'm thinking specifically here, for example, about Rabbi Yitz Greenberg's notion that we can divide Jewish history into these three epochs, the biblical, the exilic or the rabbinic, and then the modern era of engagement in the world of political power. And Rabbi Greenberg kind of creates this very sharp discontinuity between these different ages, not only in a political sense, but in a theological sense. And what you do is to sort of provide us with a thread that goes all the way back, to ancient Israel, to Josephus Flavius, and you show this perpetual tension and struggle between idealism, the star, and realpolitik, the scepter, and how is that has sort of manifested itself throughout human history. So I certainly have quite a few questions for you, and maybe I'll begin and allow our viewers a bit of time to pose some questions for you. Let me touch upon two themes. One, a little bit more historical, philosophical, and again, I think this is a moment where the Jewish people, we need to expand our historical imagination. History is not a perfect lens through which to understand our reality, but it's the best that we have, right? We're terrible at predicting the future, and so history is really the best guide, an imperfect guide that we have. But I want to ask you this question. One of the sort of central themes of international relations theory is this distinction that we make between great powers and small and medium-sized powers, where perhaps one way to distinguish between the two is that great powers have a sense of themselves as being capable of shaping the international system in their own image, right? We go back to this Wilsonian idea of making the world safe for democracy, right? Woodrow Wilson's kind of famous phrase that America should make the world safe for democracy. What that means is that at the beginning of the 20th century, there's a power and a confidence that the United States acquires, and America begins to try to shape the world in line with its own values. I think that when we look around the world today, China is trying to shape the world in line with its own values and its own domestic political preferences. Russia is trying to do the same in its environment, and so on and so forth. But that is a luxury that small powers and medium-sized powers don't have. And what that means is that smaller powers, small in terms of demography, in terms of diplomatic and military heft and economic heft, kind of have to accommodate themselves to an existing international system. They can't have the ambition of shaping the world in their own image because they're simply not big and powerful enough. But I think that in Israel, we find a very interesting example of a really, physically very, very small country that not only kind of punches way, way above its weight in terms of international influence, but perhaps also has a sense of itself, and maybe you'll disagree here, as a country that really needs to shape the international system in some respects in alignment with its own preferences, and certainly to have a global outlook when it comes to intelligence gathering and influence, because the stakes for its survival are just too high, and it can't afford to live in an international system that is too hostile to it. So I think this is sort of like a central dilemma to Israel. How does Israel kind of accommodate itself to a shifting international order over which it has relatively little power, and at the same time try to shape at least its region in line with its existential needs and preferences? Is that a dilemma that you have some thoughts on?
Yeah, I think that you know, going back to Ben Gurion, as I said, he was very much aware that Israel is not only a country but a civilization with a mission. And one of the dilemmas, by the way, faced by Israel, something I forgot to mention between realism and idealism, one of the key elements of that dilemma emerged very soon regarding the relation with the diaspora. Because in its Declaration of Independence, Israel calls upon all the Jewish diasporas to join the national revival, and even its law of return, passed shortly after independence, basically granted, automatic citizenship to all Jews around the world, basically turning every Jew around the world into a potential citizen of the state of Israel. And that created tensions with many countries, first and foremost the Soviet Union, but also with friends, countries say, you cannot turn our Jewish citizens into your own potential citizens. You cannot call for the gathering of the exiles and have good relation with the Soviet Union because we're against it. And that Ben Gurion understood very, very quickly that Israel, one of the main attractions of Israel as globally was for the Jewish diasporas as being a source of hope and pride. But if you do that, you also clash with many countries that oppose the very idea of Jewish national sovereignty and of a Jewish state that calls upon all Jews to join it. And that created a very clear tension with the Soviet Union. Now, Ben Gurion, of course, was aware of the fact that Israel was a very small country. Obviously, that was a very strong attraction for the Jewish diasporas, but also had to excel in terms of science and research and innovation, which is also why he tried to convince Albert Einstein to become president of Israel, because for him it was really a symbol of this Jewish excellence, of this soft power. Of course, you don't need to be the largest country in the world like the Soviet Union to have soft power. Russia doesn't really have soft power. But Ben Gurion, they're standing next to Charles de Gaulle in 1961 at the Élysée Palace. And you see de Gaulle very high, very tall, and Ben Gurion very, very, very short. But they really admired each other, and they very much respected each other because in a way, they both understood this dilemma of how to retain your influence when you're not a great power. In the case of France, not anymore. And they both had this very strong national pride, sometimes even willing to defy the strongest powers in the world, especially the United States, and know when to say no for your national pride and interest, even though sometimes you really, as you said, pitch a point, beyond your weight. But I think that's one of the reasons why Ben Gurion and de Gaulle really understood each other, even though later on, of course, de Gaulle betrayed us, but for reasons that have nothing to do with Ben Gurion. They were very similar, in fact, despite the difference of height between them, of this awareness that, of course, Israel, after all those years of exile and recovering its sovereignty in very difficult conditions, was no longer, of course, the Kingdom of Solomon. And de Gaulle knew, of course, that the France he was living was not the France of Bonaparte, but they both had this aspiration of recovering the greatness of the past, and sometimes at the price of really, challenging U.S. supremacy. And they both did it, and they both understood each other very well in that sense.
Yeah, Emmanuel, let me pose a star and scepter dilemma that I think Israel is facing today, and my question is going to dovetail with Ori's question about the lessons that you would draw from your historical research to the post-October 7th context. You began your lecture by talking about the post-October 7th kind of paradigm shift, which was the result of a collapse of the earlier conception, I would say the Israeli liberal conception, which bought into the notion that Israel could moderate its enemies through traditional modes of containment and deterrence, and in the case of Hamas, providing economic incentives in the hope that Hamas would moderate, and that logic really exploded in our faces on October 7th. Now, that, I think you are right, has led to a deep and enduring shift in Israeli strategic thinking, which I believe will be with us for at least the next generation and possibly more. So it's not contingent on this or that Israeli coalition government. I think this is a deeper structural shift in Israeli foreign policy thinking. I would call this sort of a transition from containment and deterrence to dismantlement, right? To the idea that you simply cannot afford to have these intractable enemies building a ring of fire around you, and therefore you have to be much more proactive in going out and dismantling since you can't dismantle in the short run the motivation of your enemies to annihilate you, you at least have to dismantle their capacity to do you great harm. So we've had this shift from containment, accommodation to dismantlement, but that then creates a new dilemma for Israel of how do we balance the star and the scepter. And it seems to me that at the moment, Israel is in real danger of being perceived as relying only on force and kinetic power and really being deficient in terms of the star, because we've entered this kind of reality where Iran is down but not out. Hezbollah is down but not out. The Houthis are down but not out, and we can see that they are making great efforts to rebuild their capacities to attack Israel. And Israel is now essentially pretty much every day bombing in Lebanon, in Syria, in Gaza. There's real talk of another round of fighting in Iran itself, if Iran continues to try to rebuild its missile stockpiles and its launches stockpiles. So a lot of Scepter, a lot of kinetic activity, but it seems to me much less much less of a sort of a vision of how do we resolve the security dilemma, not just through the use of force, but through the use of diplomacy and the construction of a new regional infrastructure that will be able to provide us a better basis for cooperation and peace. Do you also see the current situation as sort of tilting too much towards the kinetic and too little towards diplomacy, or do you see this somewhat differently? Where are we now in the balance between power and idealism?
That's a very good question. I think, first of all, um, as I said before, the Iron Wall collapsed both physically and conceptually on October 7th. But the truth of the matter is that when you read the Iron Wall, the article of Jabotinsky in 1923, he himself said that you cannot buy your enemies into submission. You're not going to turn them into Zionists by building hospitals and roads. That's an illusion, right? And therefore, the policy of the Israeli governments in recent years, in the past 10 or 20 years, was not at all in line with Jabotinsky, because the idea here is that you could buy Hamas into submission. And that is not true. We know it today. We learn it in the most tragic and painful manner. They took the money, they built their tunnels, they built their arsenal, and they remained completely committed to their to their demented ideology, and to their commitment to kill Jews, no matter how much money they lost. The whole Gaza Strip is destroyed. So what? They were willing to sacrifice everything. So, as Jabotinsky said over 100 years ago, you cannot buy your enemy into submission. So that's also something that we learn, I think, in a very painful manner. Now, it was necessary sorry to quote myself, but the first thing I said after October 7 is that I quoted Churchill when he spoke in Congress after Pearl Harbor, and he asked rhetorically about the Japanese attacking America and Britain. He said, they have to understand, he talked about the Germans and the Japanese, that we're going to persevere until they and the world are taught a lesson, and until they're taught a lesson which they and the world will never forget. And I said after October 7, we have to teach, Israel has to teach its enemies, and I mean all of them, back to Tehran, a lesson which they and the world will never forget. That is necessary, and I think this lesson has been more or less taught. But it's not enough, because we cannot just mow the grass, as you said, you mentioned yourself, we keep bombing here and there because it's endless. But there has been also, as a result of the war and the hostages, right? And I see that you have behind you the book of Eli Sharabi, Hostage. When you read this book and when you read the testimonies of people who were held hostages by Hamas, and I'm saying this because it's very true. People who lived completely secular lifestyles and really believed that if you would take the Gazans to the hospital and get them treated, they would love you, and their worldview has been completely shaken. And the fact that most of us, I would say today in Israel, definitely, unfortunately, those who've suffered a tragedy by being hostages, have come to realize the depth of this hatred towards Israel, towards Jews. And the fact that at the end of the day, no matter what you do, what you say, they consider yourself Jew, so you might as well be a Jew. And when you see those scenes, I mean, Eli Sharabi describes it in his book, how they would sing Shabbat songs and pray, and they had never prayed in their life. So what I'm saying is that there is something happening in Israel, something that has happened after October 7. Yes, it's not only the scepter. There is, I think, a very strong awareness that when you live in such an environment and when people have such a hatred towards you just because you're a Jew, so you might as well find out and figure out what it means to be a Jew and give it a content. Doesn't mean everybody has to become religious and observe. That's not saying. I'm just saying that because of this very, very profound crisis, there has been, I think, there is, in fact, this whole process in Israeli society of a young generation of people who internalize the fact that, being a Jewish country and being the Jewish people means something and is supposed to mean something. And like the zeitgeist of 30 years ago during the Oslo process, which was that we're just going to cut ourselves off from our past. We're all going to be friends and build bridges and infrastructures, and everybody is going to have great airports, and we're just going to be like Luxembourg now. Because that is, if you're going to have this paradigm, believe me, that is not what the other side has something else in store for you. So I think this crisis of October 7 has also created a kind of ideological and conceptual paradigm shift, which is in fact, in a way, the very opposite of Oslo 30 years ago, which was peace and love and give up your history and identity and we'll all be friends. And that is, to answer your question, I would say the star part of this change of policy and paradigm.
Okay. Emmanuel, let me end by posing to you two questions that we've received. It's actually three questions, but from two individuals that we've received in writing, and I'll read them out. Goni is asking, and I'm going to read this out. Israel was supposed to be, as Ben-Gurion proclaimed, a nation like all other nations. To Herzl, this meant the end of anti-Semitism, and Zionism was intended to be the antidote to the endemic anti-Semitism of exile. This ideal is foundational to Zionist thought, and for much of Israel's history, speaking of anti-Semitism within Israel itself was considered almost heretical. Yet reality is beginning to set in. The anti-Semitism seen on university campuses has reached the broader public and even entered the halls of government. For most of Israel's existence, the assumption was that the diaspora would address these issues while Israel would focus on the power politics of the Middle East. In an October 8th world, how is Israeli foreign policy changing and perhaps deviating from the long-held assumption that it would concern itself solely with regional power politics as it reemerges alongside the diaspora in the fight against anti-Semitism? So I guess what Goni is saying is that another shift that has occurred post October 7th is that perhaps the old division, as he sees it, between sort of Israel doing foreign policy for Israel and the Jewish diaspora having to sort of deal with questions pertaining to world Jewry, particularly to anti-Semitism, that distinction has eroded or perhaps changed, and how is Israeli foreign policy taking into account this shift in mood, this darkening environment for Jews around the world who now have to confront more assertive and more violent anti-Semitism? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. First of all, I don't agree that Zionism was ever supposed to solve the question of anti-Semitism. I think it's a myth. When Herzl said the deal is off, what he meant is that once we have a country, people will stop hating us. He never said that. He never thought that. The idea was just that we've been promised a world in Europe where if we check the national component of our identity, will be welcomed as equal citizens. This promise has been broken, right? So no matter how much we try to only be a religion, we are also a nation. We're also people. So we're just going to rebuild the national component of our existence. It doesn't mean that we're now going to live in a world where nobody hates the Jews. Herzl never thought that. Ben-Gurion never thought that. It was just a very practical approach to the fact that the Jews had to rebuild their national sovereignty and that it had become possible given the changes in the international order at the beginning of the 20th century. Okay. And this whole idea again of Zionism, Zionist thought, I don't know what it means. I just know that for 2,000 years, the Jews have been praying 3 times a day to come back to Jerusalem, that they end their weddings with next year in Jerusalem. So what does it mean? Zionism, Zionist. So any Jew who throughout history had a Jewish lifestyle, the return to Zion was the central part of their lifestyle and identity, and that's how the Jews survived. And I don't think either Ben Gurion or Herzl thought that anti-Semitism would disappear. What we do witness today, however, is the fact that precisely because today Israel has become such a success story, and because it's become the core of Jewish identity and existence, anybody today in the diaspora who wants a Jewish education or Jewish future, they send their kids to Israel, at least for a year. They buy an apartment in Israel. Israel has become the center of Jewish life, both physically and spiritually. And that is obvious to everybody, whether they hate the Jews or they like the Jews, right? And therefore, you have this complete blurring of distinction today when people in the diaspora or in campuses, why do they say the Zionists? Because after the Holocaust, it's not acceptable to say you want to kill Jews and you hate the Jews. So you have to find a diversion, right? So you say the Zionists, but most Jews, not all of them, but most of the Jews are Zionists in the sense that yes, they believe that the Jews should have a country, even if they don't want to live in it. So what we see today when it comes to Israel's foreign policy is that it's obviously today part of the one of the tasks of Israel's foreign policy, realizing when you see what happened in Dublin 2 days ago, right? It is to remove the name of a Jew from a street if it reminds you of something somewhere else in Europe a few years ago. But of course, you don't say, I'm just going to remove the name of a Jew from, in the case of Dublin, of a park. Why am I doing it? I'm doing it for the good. Because in fact, what did the Germans say in the 30s? The Jews are evil. They're evil. They want to destroy Germany. They want to control the world. They want to rape your wife and your daughter. They want to steal your money. So by fighting them, you're doing good. So today they do the same thing. They say Israel is evil. They commit genocide. They're guilty of apartheid. These people are evil. So if you happen to be a Jew who lives in Dublin or elsewhere, and if you don't completely condemn and hate this country, you're part of the evil, right? And even if you're Peter Beinhardt, and you say, yes, I completely agree. I hate Israel. They shouldn't exist. I'm against them. But it's never enough. Because if you go and give a talk to Tel Aviv University to address those evil people and try to re-educate them, then that's it. And so it's obvious today to whoever hasn't understood yet that it is the same exact procedure. You turn the Jews, today the Jewish state, into the incarnation of evil. You invent crimes and evil deeds that justify tearing the pictures of babies who've been kidnapped because it's evil. These people are evil. So it cannot be that they don't deserve what's happening to them. We just have to understand that the same way that the Hamas terrorists who crossed the border on October 7, at the museum, the Museum of Tolerance in Jerusalem, they have an exhibit on October 7, and at the very entrance, they have one of the sheets that were found on the one of the Hamas terrorists. The text that they were given, they said, the enemy is an illness that has to be completely eliminated, uproot the liver, kill them completely. Like you're basically doing something good, a religious commandment, by completely eliminating those people. And so that's how this hatred works. You turn the Jews, you turn Israel into this complete evil, and therefore, by fighting them, even by killing them, even by raping them, you're actually serving a greater good. And that's what we're facing today. All the Jews, whether they're Israeli or not, doesn't matter.
Emmanuel, let me pose one last question for you. This comes from Joel, and it's a big topic. We can spend a lot of time on it, and we are technically out of time. But please indulge us for a couple more minutes to address this question. And Joel asks, Jewish people have been. This is very much dovetails with what you've just been saying. Jewish people have been the recipients of negative propaganda in the past, i.e., blood libels, Nazi propaganda, Russian propaganda, and also currently with social media. We don't seem to be able to turn the tide on this propaganda. Do you agree? And is there any way to turn the tide? I know we can spend a lot of time on this. Perhaps we should have a separate conversation just on this big and important topic. But briefly, do you have any thoughts about the information war that we are facing, and how does a very small people, 15 million people globally, who are very internally divided and have very many different views, confront a social media enabled tsunami of misinformation and information warfare?
Well, it's more than misinformation. We need to understand the mechanism of this propaganda, right? And this mechanism is one of inversion, right? It's what psychologists call projection. And this, the Russians, of course, are masters of it. I mean, Soviet propaganda made a huge service to the Arab world by basically explaining to them how propaganda works. You speak the language of the audience that you want to convince, right? So in the Western world, they want to hear human rights, international law, whatever. So fine, speak that language. Don't say that you want to kill the Jews. Don't be stupid, right? You have to speak in terms of self. So you are the one in favor of international law, of justice, of peace, even though it's all a lie. It doesn't matter. Even better. And so what you do is that you turn the reality around, right? So you want to kill the Jews. You want to convert the West to Islam, right? You want women to stay in the kitchen and cover their face, etc., etc. But don't say it. So what you say is the very opposite, right? And you're the forces of jihad. So you just kill people, you want to convert them. But now you're going to say you want peace, justice, self-determination, and international law. And try to say it with a straight face. Okay? And that's what the Russians taught the Arabs. That's how you do it. And so how do you do it? Okay, so how did a small tribe from Saudi Arabia became an empire, from Morocco to Indonesia? By conquest and colonialism, by imposing the Arab language and the Quran on all these people from Morocco to Indonesia, right? So, and the Jews freed themselves from this colonialism. So you invert the historical narrative. They are the colonialists, and you are in favor of a national self-determination. It's the opposite of truth, but it works. It just works, right? So you just have to be aware of the mechanism. It's the inversion of truth. Okay, so you want to conquer and you spread war, as Samuel Huntington said, Islam has bloody borders, but you say you want peace. I want peace, right? And Islam is a religion of peace, as we know. And you speak about international law, because we know, of course, that all Arab and Muslim states in the world today care a lot about legality and freedom and human rights and international law, right? So what is, for example, free Palestine? Is somebody against freedom in the West? So people say, oh, free Palestine, I'm for freedom, right? Of course, free like all the rest of the Arab world. Like, where in the Arab world is there freedom, for goodness sake, right? And what does it mean? It basically means eliminating Israel. But you don't say eliminate Israel, you say free Palestine. So everybody wants freedom. So you just have to be aware of the mechanism. As long as you're not aware of the mechanism, you cannot fight it. It doesn't mean that you're going to win all the time, but when you face people and you know exactly how they're manipulating public opinion, it's much easier to expose them and to fight them. Because then you can do the same inversion yourself, and that's what we have to do. Because again, you have to you have to expose this very disingenuous system of inversion, and know how they're thinking. How the Russians, for example, they're the ones who submitted the UN resolution 975 of Zionism, racism, right? Because they knew that you cannot deny, going back to what I said before, of the Jews being a nation. If the right to self-determination is universal, how can you deny it only to the Jews? So what the Russians did is brilliant. They say, well, what we'll do is that we'll say that the Jews are out of luck, and only in their case, self-determination is intrinsically racist, right? So, for example, how do the Arabs try to deny Israel's legitimacy and right to existence? Instead of calling it Jewish self-determination, they call it supremacy. Supremacy. Having your own nation state is supremacy. Supremacy is bad, right? What is the nature of a Japanese nation state, of a Korean nation state, of a Swedish nation state? Is it supremacy? No, it's national self-determination. But in the case of the Jews, Jewish supremacy. The Jews want a country. Oh, that's supremacy, right? So we just have to understand that, and the mechanism of inversion. That's the way to start. How to at least start to fight it.
Okay, thank you, Emmanuel. That was really astute and really brilliant. It doesn't deal with the technological aspect of this, which is the social media and the bots, etc.
Then you just have to buy TikTok, and if you have 40 billion, do like Elon Musk, who bought Twitter. Somebody has to buy TikTok, and that's it.
Yeah, but you've analyzed the information and psychological mechanism of this and brilliantly. Clearly, we could go on for hours. We can't. You've already been very, very generous with your time, and we will find an opportunity to continue this conversation. Hopefully, to have you visit us here at Stanford and spend more time with our faculty and student. That was really a tour de force, and congratulations on the new book. And I would encourage everybody to follow Emmanuel's writing and look him up. This is our last webinar for 2025. We will meet you all on the other side of Hanukkah and the winter break. Our next webinar will be led by my friend and colleague Ori Rabinovitz. It will be with Sima Shine and Raz Zimt, and it will address the topic of Iran's nuclear program and where do we go next with the Iranian threat, because I think we all understand that challenge has not gone away. So I want to wish everybody happy Hanukkah, happy holidays, and to see you all healthy and well early in the new year in 2026. Emmanuel, I look forward to seeing you soon in Jerusalem or out here in the Bay Area. Thank you, everyone, and see you soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Amichai. Bye-bye.